20,000 children have been removed from the war zone, but not on a train. They were removed in coffins or buried alive. And that has not yet provoked Mr. KC from framing a warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a disgrace.
Hello and welcome to Beyond The Ballot Box. I'm Dashran Johan. We are all part of a global capitalist system dominated by US hegemony and imperialist force. This is especially true since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, it was such a monumental moment that American political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. Clearly, he was wrong. Decades later, Fukuyama himself admitted so. Today, China's rise, among many other factors, has challenged the global dominance of American imperialism and neoliberalism. But some experts say an empire in decline is at its most dangerous. So how do we make sense of this changing global political economy? My guest on today's show is none other than Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian, journalist, political commentator, and prominent intellectual. He's currently based in New York. He's written numerous books, including some of my favorites, Red Star Over the Third World, on Cuba, and The Withdrawal, the latter two he wrote with Noam Chomsky. And he's also the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which recently published a paper titled Hyper-imperialism, a dangerous, decadent new stage. Vijay, welcome to the show. It's an absolute honor to have you on and to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's great to be with you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
So, before we talk about hyper-imperialism, first tell us, what exactly is imperialism?
Yeah, it's something that people in Malaysia would be familiar with. People in India certainly familiar with. It's a simple concept, actually, which has become almost taboo to talk about. The concept is where you basically undermine the sovereignty of a people. So, there's a form of imperialism where you come in and you take over the territory of a people and you take over their political sovereignty. That's called colonialism, where you come in, you take over the land, you run things for the people there. You don't allow them any kind of political say in how their world is structured and so on. But colonialism doesn't exhaust imperialism, because you can win independence politically. You can put your flag up, what Frantz Fanon called flag independence, but you can still have your sovereignty constrained. You can still not be able to make a lot of decisions by yourself, political decisions about the economy, political decisions about society, culture, and so on. And that, lack of sovereignty over economic decision-making, cultural decision-making, and so on, is, broadly put, imperialism, where the decisions are made elsewhere. Sometimes the decisions aren't even made. They are baked into the cake of the structure. So it's very hard to break out of things. For instance, if you are an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished goods, it's very hard to break out of in a sense, the bind that's been placed upon you during the time of colonialism. So even if you are formally independent, you're sort of running in circles trying to produce more raw materials so that you can import necessities of the modern world, including energy, oil or natural gas or whatever, very expensive compared to, things like rubber that you might export or sugar or whatever. These things much cheapened commodity prices for these things. So that constraint of sovereignty effectively is imperialism. And it's been around in the modern world from the beginning. One might even say modernity was born alongside, imperialism.
So Is what you're saying, what you're describing right now, also interchangeable with terms like neocolonialism? Because this idea that, yes, in many countries, including Malaysia, if we walk outside, we don't see British soldiers or, let's say, American soldiers waltzing up and down our streets anymore, but there is still enormous wealth extraction from the global south to the global north. And these terms we will discuss in just a second. But is what you just described a minute ago similar to this concept of neocolonialism?
So the term neocolonialism was really best described by the first head of government of Ghana, who led the fight against British imperialism in what was then the Gold Coast. And that's Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah in 1965 published a book called Neocolonialism. Now, what Nkrumah was doing in that book, and by the way, that book was reviewed by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the United States government. And the book was published in 1965, reviewed by the CIA. The following year, there was a coup d'etat against Mr. Nkrumah. And many people in the CIA said in the records that effectively he was couped because of a book he wrote. The book was very important. He offered a very strong criticism of the world order. Now, Kwame Nkrumah used the term neocolonialism as a way to basically make a moral argument that colonialism might have ended, but a new form of colonialism has arrived, and that, the African continent was being recolonized by different means. Within the book itself, he writes a lot about imperialism, the tentacles of multinational corporations, the fact that a country like Ghana was stuck exporting cocoa, importing finished products from around the world. About 15 years after Mr. Nkrumah published this book, Walter Rodney, who is from Guyana and was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, published another superb book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And in that book, Rodney also describes how after colonialism comes this period of, let's call it neocolonialism, where the neocolonial structure, aka imperialism, impinges the ability of new states to have sovereignty over their decision making. So in a sense, it's a synonym, but it's also trying to do something moral, which is at the time of decolonization, to bring the word colonial back into play and say, actually, we are not post-colonial nations. We are nations that are struggling with a structure of neocolonialism. Without going into the whole thing of imperialism, which is a very charged word, and came and in a way became a slogan of the left. These thinkers, politicians, after all, Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, goes on to found the Workers' and People's Party in Guyana and is assassinated in 1980. Walter Rodney also, as a politician, was well aware that, you don't want to walk around just throwing the slogan imperialism out there. Right. It might be emptied of content. So let's be precise. Let's be filled with empirical content. Let's be, a little unique in using this term neocolonialism with all the weight of the word colonialism within it.
So, like you said, imperialism in and of itself is already a very charged word. So, how do you contextualize the period we are in right now, which you call hyper-imperialism? Could you define and contextualize hyper-imperialism, its key characteristics, and its implications for global political economy?
Well, to do that, Darshan, I'm going to have to periodize the last 100 years, because otherwise you don't understand why this is something different. The term imperialism was used actually very positively, over the course of European history. In other words, when the British imperialists saw themselves wearing the clothes of the Roman imperialists. That's where the term comes from. It's the Roman Empire, Pax Romana, the great Roman peace. The British would talk about Pax Britannica and so on. They really fashioned themselves after the Romans. They didn't see anything negative in the term imperialism. But British liberals began to be critical of imperialism. In fact, a liberal writer, John Hobson, wrote a very moving book filled with data about how imperialism was impoverishing parts of the world. A generation before Hobson, an Indian who lived in Britain, Dadabhai Naoroji, and actually was a member of parliament in the UK, Dadabhai Naoroji wrote a book about un-British rule in India. You get un-British rule, like this is not cricket.
Right.
You're not following the rules. In un-British rule, Naoroji talked about the drain of wealth, how Britain was draining wealth from India. So a critical voice opens up within the British Empire at the intellectual level about imperialism. Lenin, the Russian Marxist, discovers Hobson's book, reads it very carefully, and then tries to understand why is it that the European countries have gone into this fratricidal war in 1914, the so-called Great War. Why? And what Lenin argues, looking at the materials in Hobson and other liberal writers, is that, you see, what capitalism does is it develops within a country largely, and firms have a tendency to become monopolies within countries. Right. Then they ask their governments to help them get an advantage in other countries. And what then occurs is inter-capitalist crises, Lenin argued, become inter-imperialist wars. So that the Great War of 1914, he argued in his text Imperialism, is a war between different imperial powers that were trying to get benefits for their domestic capitalist concerns. So that was the period of Lenin. Now, right after Lenin finished this pamphlet, which was supposed to answer the question, why do these countries gone to war? He wasn't writing a general theory of imperialism. It's a very specific task he set himself. Unfortunately, that text has been seen as a general theory of imperialism across time. It's a very wrong reading of that text. Anyway, right after Lenin wrote that text, published the text, comes the Russian Revolution. And Lenin goes back to Russia. He's able to enter Russia and leads the October Revolution. There was a bourgeois revolution in February, and then he leads the October Revolution. Now, the world changes with the establishment of the Soviet Republic, and after that, the USSR, because then a large part of the world enters what they call the socialist bloc. Well, from roughly 1917 until roughly 1989, when the Soviet Union collapses, you see a tendency for the inter-imperialist conflict between the major, capitalist powers dampen. The existence of the Soviet Union brings them all together in an anti-communist bloc.
Right.
And they tried their best to mediate their differences. This is actually best explained when we look at two different groupings. NATO, created in 1949, brings together all the major capitalist powers under one military command, unifies their military together, that basically dampens their tendency to fight with each other. France and Germany don't fight with each other after 1945. I have a view that the war that breaks out in 1914 ends in 1945 with a short halftime in between. So after 1945, the capitalist powers really don't fight each other. They unite. In 1989, so in that period from 1917 to 1989, the principal distinctions in the world are between the socialist bloc, the third world bloc, and the capitalist bloc. That's basically the geography. And inter-imperialist conflict is weakened considerably in this period. Then in the third period, you begin to see the collapse of the Soviet Union from the 1980s onward, and you begin to see a new era where the United States tries to exercise its domination over the whole world.
Right.
And that some people have called that the unipolar era. That's when the US attempts, unsuccessfully, I must say, to have dominion over the world. Unsuccessfully, because right through this period, they kept finding enemies. They call them rogue states, whether Iran or, it's South Korea, North Korea, and so on. Rogue states wouldn't submit, so they didn't have total dominion of the world. And then the contradictions of globalization and so on had the impact. So then we enter the fourth stage, which is hyper-imperialism. Now, in 2006, 2007, that's when the third stage ends, from roughly 1989, 90 to 2006, 7. So a very short period of this sort of, attempt at unipolarity. When that begins to end, it ends really with a real serious economic crisis, the crisis of 2006-7, the entry of the Third Great Depression. This stuns the Chinese, into a kind of rapid change of plan. Rather than be in this satanic embrace with the United States, they start to build a Belt and Road system and so on. It's in this fourth phase that the United States and its allies, this global North bloc, recognizes that they cannot contest the Chinese in an inter-capitalist conflict. They can't, outspend the Chinese in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia. They can't actually build the kind of modern infrastructure that the Chinese are building even in their own territories. And therefore, the only weapon they have to try to maintain their hegemony is military force. So we use the term hyper-imperialism to talk about this kinetic character of the current conflict, where the United States sees enemies everywhere and wants to use its immense military to destroy anybody and anything that it sees as a threat. And these are phrases that are almost there directly in the US documents: near-peer rivals, weakening Russia, not permitting China to rise, and so on. This is the hyper-imperialist intention, which they've broadcast quite directly.
We use these terms a lot, global north and global south, when discussing political economy. People on the left especially use the term to talk about wealth extraction. But what exactly are we talking about here when we say global north and global south?
Well, it's very important to be as precise as possible. When the countries of the global south, whatever that means, we'll get to it, started to tell the West that we don't agree with your interpretation of what's happening in Ukraine, there was a great deal of puzzlement in the capitals of the advanced countries. In Japan, for instance, the Japanese foreign minister's spokesperson was directly asked in a press conference, what is the global south? And she couldn't answer the question. She said, I think it's a synonym for developing countries. And, if they don't know what these terms are, you can't expect people, or somebody walking down the street to be asked with a camera, with a microphone, what's the global south? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
So we spent a lot of time looking at this, and we basically made a list of all the 193 countries that are there in the United Nations, one way or the other. We looked at a number of different, data points, worked with Global South Insights to develop an enormous, data set on this. So let me just quickly define global north, because that's easier.
Right.
Now, the global north is actually a bloc. It is united in a military alliance, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There are actual countries that have signed up to come to war to join a member state if it is ever attacked or if it needs assistance. Right. That's a military alliance. Russia and China, for instance, don't have a military alliance. They have a strategic alliance. That means if Russia is at war, China is under no obligation to go to war on behalf of Russia. But Germany and the United States have a military alliance. If Germany goes to war, the United States is treaty obliged to enter that war. So that's a military alliance, number one. Number two, and that was formed, by the way, in 1949. It's dominated by the United States, which plays a major role in NATO. Number two, there is, since 1974, there has been a a political alliance, a political bloc, which is 7 countries: Canada, the United States, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom. That's the G7 countries. That's merely 7, except that there are partner states with the G7. Some of these partner states are within what is the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, a global north run quote unquote think tank. It's actually a place to formulate common policy. So there's a political wing of the global north, and it's centered around the G7 countries. Once again, United States plays a big role there. Now, it's not to say that they don't disagree on this or that policy. Well, for instance, most of the other G7 countries vote against the United States when it comes to the embargo on Cuba. There are a lot of disagreements on several things, but when push comes to shove on an important issue, Ukraine, for instance, they all line up. There's no disagreement. Again, Macron can go on a limb and so on, but he's pulled back very quickly. So there's a political alliance. But most importantly, and something people don't talk of enough, there's an intelligence sharing agreement.
Right.
Started off as the Five Eyes, that was the 5 settler colonial countries: Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. But now it's the 14 Eyes, includes many other countries. They share intelligence. That makes them into a bloc. So this global north shares intelligence, has common political leadership, and has a military alliance. It's a pretty solid indicator of a bloc, and we call that bloc the global north. The United States is primus inter pares, first among equals, as it were, is a leading power in this bloc. And in that text, Hyper-imperialism, we go into the military spending aspect of it. And what we find is that the global north spends around 75% of the world's military budget, annual military budget, 75% by the global north. It's a real thing. Now, the global south is much less precise. There is no political body in the global south. There is the NAM, the non-aligned movement, set up in 1961, but it really doesn't formulate a common policy for the global south. It's a place where they meet and have certain discussions about solidarity and so on. It's not common policy setting. There is no military alliance of the global south. None exists. In fact, very few global south countries sign military agreements with other countries. Very few, just a handful of states. And mostly they sign military agreements with the United States because they have bases, 1 or 2 or 3 of the 902 US military bases. And certainly there's no intelligence sharing amongst the global south. It's not a bloc. It's several different groupings. There are some socialist countries that have a close alignment, particularly in Latin America.
Right.
Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on. Bolivia, they are within the ALBA TCP trade and political agreement. The Chinese have built the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but even that is really quite a loose grouping of different countries. India and Pakistan both belong to the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and they have their own problems with each other. You can't say they belong to any kind of grouping. So the global south is a way, on the one hand, the remainder, those who are not in the global north, but it's also countries that have been impacted by colonialism. They have that heritage, inclusive of Malaysia. I mean, it's very interesting. It was very, very interesting to see the Malaysian Prime Minister standing next to Olaf Scholz of Germany and schooling Mr. Scholz about how to understand Gaza, because he was speaking from the perspective of colonialism, understanding what it means to have been colonized and brutalized. I mean, if any child in Malaysia doesn't know about the Malaya emergency, the last period of colonial rule, they must go and read up on it. The British were brutal in that last phase. Brutal. They treated people, this is after World War II, they treated people with a great deal of violence. It wasn't just putting the insurgency down, they brutalized people. And all of that is important for us to know. And I must say, Anwar Ibrahim was aware, I think, of that history in order to have spoken in that particular way, Darshan. And that, I think, helps define the global south. It's not just the developing countries, it's these countries which have an enduring memory of what it meant to be humiliated as a people during the era of high colonialism.
You brought up Olaf Scholz, and that brings me to my next question, right? Because it seems like this divide between the dominating global north, led by the US, and the rest, loosely we can call it the global south, we can see this divide and the domination and the power imbalance and the solidarity perhaps among the global south in the Palestine issue. Like you brought up Anwar Ibrahim, the Malaysian Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim was one example what he spoke to the German press. I'm wondering, Vijay, how does the situation in Palestine exemplify the broader struggles of the global south against imperialism, against colonialism?
What is this memory of colonialism that I was talking about? What is that? It's important to understand that residue. There's a phrase that I use a lot, the international division of humanity. There's a belief, for instance, that when a factory, the Rana Plaza factory just outside Dhaka in Bangladesh, when it collapses, hundreds of workers are killed. You don't really see individual stories of these workers in the press of the West. When there's when a big tidal wave strikes Malaysia and Thailand, the stories that the Western media cover are, the tourists who are there. They don't cover the story about the Thai person or the Malay that gets swept into the Indian Ocean. That's not interesting. I'm thinking about the tsunami of 2004. The stories picked up were, this Australian family was killed. Now, it's a tragedy that they were killed. But what about the person making their beds? What about in the next room, there was, let's say, an Indian family, also tourists, vanish into the waters. What about the security guard who tried to save everybody and was dragged into the water? There's an international division of humanity. When the conflict breaks out in Ukraine, Western press is out there crying about blue-eyed and blonde-haired children being, brutalized. But when Palestinians are dying, for almost 40,000, 20,000 of them children, the care and concern for their humanity is minimized. And that's the international division of humanity that, somebody like the Prime Minister of Namibia, Sara, can visualize, or Naledi Pandor, the Foreign Minister of South Africa, or Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, they can see that. They know what it feels like to be treated on the other side of the international division of humanity. They know what it feels like. In South Africa, it was just yesterday that apartheid, 40 years ago, that apartheid was in existence. The foreign minister of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, was alive during the time when she was a second-class citizen, lived on officially on the other side of the international division of humanity. The Prime Minister of Namibia was alive when she lived on the opposite side of the international division of humanity. These are residues of that earlier history. So when people see the way in which they are brutalizing Palestine, look, people say, why are all these students in the United States and other countries so upset? It must be because they are watching videos on TikTok. It's not true. It's not true. They may be watching the videos on TikTok, but where are the videos from Ukraine which show children being brutalized like this? It's a plain fact that the Russians are not bombing the Ukrainians in the same way as the Israelis are bombing the Palestinians. And that's partly because the Russians don't see the Ukrainians as a lesser species. They see them, they are also part of the Slavic peoples and this, that, and the other. They don't see them as lesser than human. But the Israelis see the Palestinians as lesser than human. That's the old colonial trick, isn't it? That's the old colonial thing, that you are on the other side of the international division of humanity. You can be brutalized. You can be barbarized. Your people don't matter. simply don't matter. That's what really captivates our feeling. I mean, I got a link to that also, the fact that there is a religious aspect to this, that the majority of Palestinians are Muslim, and a lot of countries with Muslim majority populations, feel some kinship. The Ummah comes into play. And especially during Ramzan or the month of Ramadan, this was heightened, this feeling of the Ummah being damaged in this way. I don't want to neglect the question of this playing a role, especially for Muslims. But I also want to emphasize that this colonial residue, the international division of humanity, makes this an anti-colonial fight much more than a pro-Muslim argument.
And then it is absolutely an anti-colonial struggle that we are witnessing. At least that's how I look at it as well. But, speaking about this division of humanity, right? What is your take? Because recently the International Criminal Court, they issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of state of Israel, as well as leaders from Hamas. Now, the U.S. State Department spokesperson says the U.S. fundamentally rejects this announcement. And I think even the President Joe Biden came out and said that, we cannot equate and Hamas with, Benjamin Netanyahu. Even if we disagree with certain things that Benjamin Netanyahu said, we cannot equate these two forces. I think people on the global south will say, yes, we shouldn't be equating. I mean, we accept the International Criminal Court, arrest warrants, go after everyone perceived as war criminals. But if you're talking about not equating, people on the global south would say, yes, we shouldn't equate because one is a genocidal oppressor carrying out apartheid, and one more is the other side, Hamas. However you want to look at it, they are resistance fighters. They are resistance force challenging the oppressor. How do you see it, and your take on what the US, whether it's a spokesperson, Joe Biden has said in response to the ICC's arrest warrants?
Well, the International Criminal Court is, again, a treaty body of the United Nations. It was created by the Rome Statute and so on. The treaty is pretty interesting and is worth reading. 1996 treaty that establishes the court. The court has a very poor reputation of going after global North politicians. After all, Kofi Annan in 2004 on BBC, Kofi Annan then was the Secretary General of the UN, 2004 goes on BBC and calls the US war on Iraq illegal. If the US war on Iraq is illegal, if it is a war of aggression, which is exactly the implication, if it is not a war that is defensive, then it has violated the UN Charter. It's an aggressive war. If it's an aggressive war that kills over 1 million Iraqis, at what point does the ICC frame warrants against George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Tony Blair, and so on? There was no question of a warrant. So for a long time, people have felt that the ICC is quite biased on behalf of the global North and against the global South. I mean, the people they had indicted for years were all Africans. It was one thing. And then suddenly they came in and indicted a few Yugoslavians. But that was it. I mean, there was no indictment for any global North politician for the hideous and illegal wars that they have conducted in this recent period. It was interesting because the ICC has had on its docket the question of Israel for many years. During the Trump administration, lead prosecutor Fatih Bensouda opened a file on the question of Afghanistan, all to investigate all war crimes. And she opened a file on Israel. This is the war of 2014, where Israel, within a few days, really killed thousands of Palestinians. And she opened these files for investigation. At the time, the US government said to her directly in public, this was John Bolton, who was a high official of the Trump administration, said that Ms. Bensouda will not get a visa to come to the United Nations. Now, this is a violation of the agreement between the US government and the UN. The UN is based in New York. Officials of the United Nations have free access to come to the UN office. To say we won't allow you to enter the United States really is a violation of that agreement. And then John Bolton said, and we're not ever going to permit your family members to enter the US. No Disneyland for the Bensouda children and so on. I mean, it's a ridiculous mafia move by the US government. That was Fatih Bensouda. Well, the current lead prosecutor, Karim Khan King's Counsel, is a British national who has a very checkered history. His brother was a crooked politician, but that's not Karim Khan. Now, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, very quickly, Mr. Karim Khan framed warrants against Vladimir Putin and his associate on the grounds that the Russians were removing children from the war zone into Russia. Indeed, that could be considered a war crime under the terms of population transfer. And that was the way they did it. But remember now, just pause for a minute. They received ICC warrants within days for moving children from the war zone. Now, right now, when Mr. Karim Khan KC has made this press conference where he said, we are considering, remember, they haven't framed warrants. We are considering warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas leaders. This is 7 months into this brutal genocidal war. The International Court of Justice says plausible genocide, in which 20,000 children haven't been, well, I suppose they have been removed from the war zone, but not on a train. They were removed in coffins or buried alive. And that has not yet provoked Mr. KC from framing a warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a disgrace. What he has done in this press conference might be fine, but it's a disgrace, and he should be removed from his position for rendering open bias in the cases of the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. Open bias. He should be forthwith removed by the UN Security Council. But of course, he will not be removed. Now, to say there's equivalence between Mr. Netanyahu and Hamas leadership is ridiculous. Hamas is an organization of the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinians are a people who are treated by UN treaty as an occupied people. The UN calls Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank the occupied Palestinian territory. It's a singular place. The OPT, occupied. It's an occupied territory. The occupying power is Israel. Several UN resolutions give the occupied people the right to resist occupation by any means necessary, including the 1960 a resolution against colonialism on behalf of decolonization. So Hamas leadership in attempting to end an occupation are not by that process committing a war crime. Now, there could be instances in the battlefield where they went out there and killed children. Those crimes should be investigated, certainly. But blanket war crime charges against the Hamas leadership is ludicrous, especially given the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruling on the South African complaint on Israel. The ICJ ruling doesn't say all sides are to blame. It directly points to the Israeli government and says there's plausible grounds for genocide because there's not only acts of genocide, but also statements of intent. And so it's doubly disappointing that Mr. Karim Khan KC decides to frame this press conference in a all sides are bad manner. Firstly, he has no legitimacy to hold his job as lead prosecutor, in my opinion. And secondly, I think it's shoddy work to have hidden behind all sides are bad at this time, 7 months in. It is, of course, entirely obvious that the United States acted as they did because the US is the shield and the provider of weapons for Israel. The United States has absolutely no legitimacy to complain about what Israel is doing because the US is utterly complicit in Israel's war, just as the Israelis have been complicit in most of the ugly US wars, including the war in Iraq.
Not to mention that the right of resistance, including armed resistance, is actually enshrined in the UN, in the Geneva Convention, right? Vijay, I want to bring back to the core of this interview, which is hyper-imperialism. Now, what does that actually mean on the ground? How does it impact people? Because there's also a lot of talk about the US empire being on a decline. Yet, when we look around, it is still undeniably the most powerful country, not just militarily, as most countries in the world still trade with the US or rely heavily on the US for FDI, for example, for the countries to grow themselves. How do you contextualize all of that?
Well, look, here's an interesting example. Earlier, in the last couple of years, Zambia, which is in southern part of Africa, southern part of Africa, Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the richest country in the world. The DRC is home to about $2 trillion worth of resources, which it cannot control. So it's the country with the richest resources, but has the poorest population in the world. So the DRC and Zambia came together because they have a great deal of complementarity in their economy. They wanted to build effectively a regional value chain. These countries produce cobalt, they produce copper, they produce everything that goes into making a battery. And so they said, we will together make a battery. And, some of the financing came from the Chinese. The Chinese are very involved in the DRC, and the Chinese were increasingly involved in Zambia. But it was effectively a Zambian DRC project. Well, this was not going to be permitted by the United States because they didn't want to see two things happen. One, regional commodity chains develop in Africa, which would cut out US multinational corporations. And secondly, any Chinese influence in this at all. So the United States did a couple of things. One is a very close agent of the US government who's based in a think tank in South Africa, which is a think tank funded by the Oppenheimer mining family. This think tank had its executive director insinuate himself into the government of Zambia, the current president. And this, kind of operation, let's say, I'm using a very strong word, but this operation effectively influenced the Zambian president against going on this alone. Then the United States assembles the African leadership, whoever they could get, in Washington for a US-Africa summit, where they hornswaggled the DRC's president, who had himself gone to Beijing and made various deals with the Chinese. They reassessed a major infrastructure funding deal with the Chinese Export-Import Bank and so on. Anyway, these guys were all dragooned to Washington, D.C. They were brought together. And then the United States announced the Lopito Corridor Project, which is what would link Zambia, the DRC, Angola, and the United States into a project to remove mined minerals and metals from Zambia, the DRC, through a port in the Lopito Corridor port in Angola, and take it out and maintain a globalized value chain, not allow this regional African value chain to develop. Well, this is classic hyper-imperialism. Right. The Zambia and the DRC didn't need the United States, in fact. They were doing this by themselves. They were fine. The US insinuates itself military threats to cut IMF assistance in getting the debt refinanced, particularly for the DRC and so on. Lots of pressure on these countries, constraint of their sovereignty, and then boom, they basically have to surrender. In this case, there was no direct military pressure, but we see a lot of direct military pressure when it counts. Ships off the coastline of the country. Venezuela facing the southern command of the United States military exercises just off the coastline, threatening an invasion and so on. These threats are not empty. Honduras faced a coup d'etat in 2009. Bolivia had a coup d'etat in 2019. I mean, again, these are not idle threats of overthrowing governments and so on. You get too far, you start making deals with the Chinese, we're going to get you. I mean, who knows what happened to Imran Khan's government in Pakistan? Who knows what happened in Sri Lanka when the new government with only one member of parliament suddenly becomes the government in charge. One member of parliament. He happened to be a pro-US fellow. I mean, who knows what's going on in these places? Lots of arm twisting, lots of threats. There's a good reason why Noam Chomsky says the United States government acts like the mafia. That's hyper-imperialism. That's the godfather theory of international relations. You can't get what you want, you go and threaten somebody. I'm going to put the head of your favorite horse in your bed.
Now, with all of, if you look at the past several decades, as the US, goes through this hyper-imperialism, they're trying to, engage in various different wars. A lot of these wars they ended up losing, whether you look at Vietnam, Iraq, their invasion of Afghanistan. Fundamentally, they have caused a lot of damage, but they didn't exactly win. Simultaneously, what was going on is we are seeing countries in the global south, obviously at the top of it, China, growing from strength to strength, India going from strength to strength, and all of this. Naturally, what people would say next is that we are seeing an empire on decline and we are moving away from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. But you've been critical of the term multipolarity in numerous of your interviews and writings. Why do you not like the term multipolarity? What would be a more accurate way of describing where we are heading towards in the near future?
Well, firstly, I don't think there are multiple poles being created. I think, it has a tendency to assume that there's a kind of flatness involved, that there's a global North Pole, there's a Chinese pole, there's a this pole and a that pole. No, there is one threatening power in the world, and that is the global North led by the United States. That's the threatening power. Most other countries are trying to live with some form of peace, development, and so on. What you are seeing is more regionalism than multipolarity. You're seeing the development again of the South American region. I live in Santiago in Chile. I'm talking to you from here. Santiago, Chile was one of the anchors of the regionalism project in the 1970s. Now it's Brazil, the biggest economy in the region. We see with the RCEP, the Regional Economic Trade Agreement, in RCEP, we see the formation of a very interesting ASEAN-led, regionalism in Asia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a kind of regionalism in Central Asia and so on. That's the direction, that's the tendency of movement. It's not towards the creation of a countervailing pole in Beijing and another pole in Moscow. The Chinese have been saying for years, we don't want to become a pole. We don't want to be seen in a direct confrontation with the US. We want to collaborate with everybody. Their phrase basically is more collaboration, less confrontation. And in a way, the atmosphere around a term like multipolarity, to me, suggests confrontation rather than collaboration. And I don't think the way after hyper-imperialism is back to inter-imperialist conflict or something like that, multipolar conflict. I think we're trying to go into a world of collaboration where the United Nations Charter is taken seriously, where development is more important than bombing. You said that the US government loses wars. In fact, it depends what you mean. The US government is very able to destroy bridges. It has a hard time building them. That's really the essence of it. They can destroy anything. They can come into Malaysia and wipe out large sections of Kuala Lumpur, but they may not be able to govern Kuala Lumpur. They may not be able to get legitimacy from the people, but they can destroy a lot of stuff. They wiped out the infrastructure in Afghanistan, but they could control what was happening after that. So I wouldn't say at the end the US government entirely loses wars. Depends what their objective is.
Right.
Their objective is to hammer their rivals. If they went to war against Iran, it would be to destroy Iran's capacity to be independent. And then Iran would have to be dependent on the United States. That's principally what they would like. And you see what happened with Iraq. They destroyed Iraq, hoping that Iraq would get dependent on the US. What ended up happening was Iraq largely became dependent on Iran. That's what happened. There are miscalculations in hyper-imperialism. But nonetheless, there is that tendency of wanting to end the subordination of people on the other side of the international division of humanity. Ending subordination is more important in a way than direct colonial control. And I think that's why they don't care if they, quote unquote, lose wars. It's far more important to win a dependence from countries on the United States.
Vijay, I could speak to you for hours, but we have to wind down this conversation. So I'll ask this last one. Where do we go from here in the face of US-led imperialism, now hyper-imperialism? What are the alternatives that we have, economic and political, especially since you've also said, try to remind people on the left, and when you go on these various interviews, that the political shift that is occurring isn't necessarily going to be led by, socialists in the sense of, it's not going to be led by the grassroots international proletariat movement with some socially liberal values and things like that necessarily. The way many people on the left would be hoping for. So what exactly are we going to move towards, and what should people on the broad left be working towards in this crucial period?
See, I very much believe that in the period ahead, the two concepts that need to anchor our thinking are the concepts of sovereignty and dignity. Countries want to exercise sovereignty over their territory. Having tried to exercise sovereignty, they have to ensure that their people lead dignified lives. If we are pushing in this direction, this demand that the people lead dignified lives will, I think, will move into the revival of a socialist project. Because for people to lead dignified lives, you can't lead dignified lives in an unequal society. That's going to revive a kind of socialist alternative. But in the interim, I think it's very important that we spend our time fighting to build sovereignty of our processes and to build the dignity of our people. A country like Malaysia, for instance, even during the financial crisis in Asia, put capital controls in place to defend the sovereignty of capital markets in Malaysia. Those kind of instruments, they are not things that are necessarily socialist, but they are about sovereignty. But once you go beyond articulating sovereignty and start thinking about dignity, well, you're on the road to socialism. That's as far as I think we'll get in our lifetime. And then we'll have to say to the next generation, here's the baton, keep running.
Vijay, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot. Great to be with you.
That was Vijay Prashad. He's the director of the Tricontinental Institute of Social Research. And I've been Dashran Johan on Beyond the Ballot Box, BFM 89.9.